Hello everyone, this is Katie Colleen here. Welcome back Colleen Clan, or if you're new, then come join the family. Today I'll be showing you how to make Auron's forearm bracer from Final Fantasy X using EVA foam. The first thing we're going to need is some measurements so that we can make a pattern. You'll need the distance around your wrist, the distance around your forearm, and the distance between your wrist and forearm measurements. Now I'm actually making this cosplay for my dad and not for myself, and his arms are a little bit bigger than my noodle arms, so his measurements are a bit bigger as well. Now if you look at Auron's forearm bracer, it only covers the front half of his forearm. So for our wrist and forearm measurements, we can divide those by 2 because we will only need half of the forearm to be covered by the bracer. And now we know that the bottom of the bracer is going to be half of that wrist measurement, and the top of the bracer is going to be the half of that forearm measurement, and the distance between them will be that measurement we took between our wrist and forearm. Auron's bracer is actually 3 separate pieces. So taking that distance between the wrist and the forearm, I'm going to divide that by 3 to divide our bracer into 3 equal sections. So I'm also going to add a little bit of flair to each of those bracer sections just to add a little bit more spiky and edgy look to it. Now there is one other little detail, and that is that these pieces are overlapping. So for our middle piece and our top piece, I'm going to trace out what we had already patterned, and I'm going to add 1 inch to the bottom. This is going to add enough surface area that we can just glue down these pieces together in that 1 inch overlap area. Now that we have a pattern that works, we can cut it out in our EVA foam. I'm using the 1/2 inch thick EVA foam floor mats, and I'm using my knife to cut out each of these forearm pieces. Don't worry too much about any rough edges during cutting. We're gonna go back later and sand them down. And now we have our 3 sections of Auron's forearm bracer. Now I would also like to add a few little details. It was hard to find any good reference pictures of this bracer, and each reference picture I could find was a little bit different with the details and color scheme. It appears that there's a small border detail around each of these 3 sections of the forearm bracer, so I'm going to add that as well. Keep in mind that we don't need this border for any of our overlapping areas. We only need the border for the pieces of the forearm bracer that will be visible. Now I'm using a 2mm craft foam, and I'm cutting out all of our border details in the same way. And each of these 2mm foam borders should line up nicely with our patterned pieces for the forearm bracer. And now we can start gluing pieces together. Now I do all of my foam gluing with contact cement, and contact cement is not very good to inhale, especially in closed spaces, so I always work with contact cement outside or in a well-ventilated place. I'm applying the contact cement to the back of the 2mm border details, and then I can press those into each of our forearm bracer pieces, and this contact cement holds really well. And then we can get into sanding. I'm using my Dremel tool, and I'll be putting a sanding bit on it. This is going to sand down any of the rough edges from cutting. You can see that my cutting was not super good when I cut out the pieces, but that's just fine, because now I can sand it all down and we'll have a nice smooth finish on all the edges. I also want to sand down the inside of the border details. I'm switching out my sanding bit for a drill bit, and I'm going to very carefully sand just the inside border of our 2mm details. Once everything has been sanded down and all the edges are smooth, then we can hit this with a heat gun. The heat gun will smooth out any of the textures in the foam, and it will also get rid of any of those sanding fuzzies that kind of stick on the edges. While I'm using the heat gun, this is also a good opportunity to shape the forearm bracer so that it's more curved to fit around the shape of a forearm. And with the heat shaping done, we are now ready to glue together the 3 pieces of the forearm bracer. I'm going back outside to use some contact cement. I'm applying the contact cement to the 1 inch overlay portion of the bracer, and then each of these pieces should fit inside each other quite nicely. And with our forearm bracer now in 1 piece instead of 3 pieces, we can move on to painting. I'm going to be priming this with a spray paint Plasti Dip. I ended up doing 2 separate layers of Plasti Dip, allowing the piece to dry in between. Once the primer is done, I can use an acrylic paint. For the first layer of paint, I used a straight black acrylic paint and covered the entire forearm bracer. For the second layer of paint, I wanted to add a bit of a different color variation. I went with a gray color for the border details, and I felt like this added a lot more dimension to the forearm bracer. Once this is all dried, I'm going over the entire forearm bracer with Mod Podge. This will just kind of seal everything up and gives it a nice finish. And here's our forearm bracer looks, but we still have a few details to add. Now in the reference picture, it looks like there are rivets at the bottom of the forearm bracer. After marking where the rivets would be placed, I brought back out my Dremel tool, and I have a drill bit on it. With my Dremel tool, I am drilling a hole through the forearm bracer. While the rivet post fits very nicely into the hole I've drilled in the EVA foam, it's a bit too thick to install the rivet as you would through leather. So I'm taking out my hot glue gun and putting hot glue into that hole that I drilled in the EVA foam, and then I am inserting the rivet before the glue dries. Now with our rivets glued down into place, we can talk about attachments. Now this forearm bracer is attached to Auron's wrist with a belt. And I do have a tutorial on how I sew my leather belts. It's made with a pleather and a packaging foam base. It's actually really cheap and easy to make if you'd like to check out that tutorial. So this bracer will have to connect to this belt. I'm using a 1-inch black elastic, and I'm measuring out how much elastic I would need to span the width of our belt. I'm going to cut out 2 pieces of elastic, and those can be glued to the inside of the forearm bracer. I'm using hot glue again for this. And once our hot glue is dried, you can see how the belt would just slide underneath these elastic loops. Now let's look at how the bracer fits in with the rest of this very complex costume. The belt that goes around Auron's wrist slides through our forearm bracer. And our forearm bracer is put over an arm wrap. I do have a tutorial on how to make arm wraps if you're interested in that as well. And then on the hand, we just purchased a pair of motorcycle gloves, and those look pretty great. Now the robe is then cinched up with a secondary belt at the elbow. And this is the anatomy of Auron's right hand. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section down below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!